Hello, everyone. This is Connor Lokar, Senior Forecaster with ITR Economics, checking in once again for another Trends Talk. So, as most of you probably noticed, this summer, most of the media attention has been dominated by that second quarter 2022 GDP data release, with really intense focus on the weakness showing up there and in other consumer segments within the US economy. But it isn't all doom and gloom out there, if you know where to look. Focusing on the industrial strengths of the segments of the economy, things do look a bit better. Now, to be fair, headline obsession with GDP as the primary data set to evaluate the US economy is nothing new, though it may be a little bit more intense than usual this cycle. But when things get a little bit erratic, as they are now, that typically happens. And nor is it necessarily unfair, as it's the broadest and most comprehensive measure of total US economic activity. However, its strength is also its drawback in that it tends to paint with a pretty broad brush across all sectors when that isn't necessarily appropriate. US industrial production, a favorite here at ITR, and as the name implies, takes a little bit more of an industrial skew and focus, which I also like to think of as a bit more intrinsic as far as what's going on underneath the surface. And because of that, more subsurface view, you're rarely going to catch headlines on US industrial production, or at least if you do, you're going to have to do a little bit of digging and probably a little bit of scrolling to find them if you want to. So, for example, recently, during the second half of 2020, the GDP view of the economy painted a pretty broadly optimistic picture of a quickly rebounding economy as reopening sectors across the country and the globe, combined with, I'll add, a healthy side order of stimulus, drove a pretty fairly and immediate reversal in consumer spending from the doldrums of the second quarter of 2020, and those GDP values soared in the third and fourth quarters of 2020. But during this time, US industrial production continued to languish in recession as manufacturers were much slower to rebound. A big chunk of our client base experienced this. And I'd say really many ITR listeners, ITR insiders, and our consulting clients, you really live in an industrial production defined world and not necessarily a GDP one. And I think that fact is going to make the next few months exceptionally challenging as folks try to digest very negative headlines that are describing market conditions that might not necessarily reflect the real-time conditions of the world and industrial markets that those folks are operating in. As of right now, US industrial production is running quite well, exceptionally well, with an annualized growth rate of 4.7% through June. Yes, that is slowing down. We're technically in phase C and decelerating, but that's running at a very healthy clip and actually at the hot end of our forecast range, up at the upper edge there. And the experience of our consulting client base in my senior forecaster role, I get to see a ton of company data, and that corroborates this. We continue to see robust shipment performance across our industrially inclined clients, in many, if not most cases, at record levels, surpassing pre-COVID levels. And if anything, they're being held back by supply chain and labor capacity issues. So that's a very different picture from the general headline sentiment that folks are picking up and are going to continue to read about here this summer. So it always comes back to, where do you live? Where do you sell? Maybe is fair as well in this economy. Not every sector is going to be in the same place at the same time. Sure, businesses that benefited directly and immediately from COVID stimulus, like consumer discretionary spend reliant businesses or the housing market, for example, they're in for a more turbulent and more challenging second half of 2022, as that stimulus support retreats from the economic system and consumer spending cools off. But industrial businesses need to take those forthcoming headlines with a few grains of salt and realize that the doom and gloom isn't there for you just yet, and that there's still business to be had, growth to be had, profitability to be had here in the second half of this year, despite what you may be reading out there to the contrary. As always, thanks for checking in. I'm Connor Lokar, and we'll see you on the next one.